Day 222 of the Trump administration ends with the president back at the White House after a trip to Texas, as that state deals with a deadly storm showing no signs of letting up. So far, crews have rescued more than 3,500 people. Officials have confirmed 9 people have died, including a veteran member of the Houston Police Department. And in about 2 hours, a curfew goes into effect in Houston. Authorities want to make sure no one can loot the homes that families have had to leave behind for safer shelter. In just one county, Harris County, the home of Houston, the storm has dumped enough rain to run Niagara Falls for 15 days. That's more than 1 trillion gallons of water. Today, President Trump visited Corpus Christi and Austin, Texas, speaking with elected officials and people working at an emergency response center. At his first stop in Texas, as much of it sits under feet of water, he mentioned many people, but none of them were the victims who lost their lives or were forced from their homes.
Senator Cruz and Senator Cornyn, thank you very much, Senator Cornyn, for being here. We appreciate it. I know it's hard to get here for both of you. You were trapped in various locations, but we appreciate you both being here. I want to thank my staff, my cabinet, Ben Carson, obviously, from HUD, and Tom Price and Linda McMahon, Small Business, our acting director. Elaine, thank you very much for the job you've done. And a man who's really become very famous on television over the last couple of days, Mr. Long. We appreciate it very much. Working with the governor and his entire team has been an honor for us. So, Governor, again, thank you very much. And we won't say congratulations. We don't want to do that. We don't want to congratulate. We'll congratulate each other when it's all finished.
We won't say congratulations. We don't want to do that. After that briefing, the president went outside and spoke to a group of supporters lined up outside a firehouse, noting that it was a good-sized crowd.
We're going to get you back and operating immediately. Thank you, everybody. What a crowd, what a turnout.
What a turnout. Tonight, the Washington Post puts it this way in its headline: even in visiting hurricane-ravaged Texas, Trump keeps the focus on himself. And Politico wrote it was a presidential trip to a deluged state where the president didn't meet a single storm victim, see an inch of rain, or get near a flooded street. The storm has left communities with tragedies that are hard to imagine and heroes just trying to help their neighbors. A 34-year veteran of the Houston Police Department, Sergeant Steve Perez, drowned in his patrol car when it became trapped in floodwaters on his way to work Sunday. His wife asked him to stay home. He said he had work to do. Then there are the neighbors in Houston who formed a human chain to help a woman in labor get out of her apartment and on her way to the hospital. And the U.S. Coast Guard, who flew in to pull a mother and her baby off the roof of a house as the water grew dangerously close. Neighbors were jumping in to help with everything they could find, from motorboats to paddle boats to jet skis, to make trips around their communities, to pull anyone who was stuck to safety. Let's bring in our leadoff panel. White House reporter for Politico, Matthew Nussbaum, White House correspondent for McClatchy Newspapers, Anita Kumar, and Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the Chicago Tribune, Clarence Page. Clarence, I'll start with you. The expectations and hopes were relatively low about President Trump's performance out there. The idea that he wouldn't be critical of his predecessors in some fashion or blame someone came true. That didn't happen. But as those newspaper headlines say, he still talked about himself and the size of the storms and the people who he surrounded himself with.
Well, it's really all about him, isn't it? That's just how he came off today. It was disappointing. I know he was very conscious of the need to avoid making the kind of optical gaffe that President George W. Bush made when he floated above the New Orleans flood of Hurricane Katrina, because they actually didn't want didn't want Air Force One to land because his footprint is so big it would have gotten in the way of the recovery and rescue efforts. Of course, President Trump wanted to do that too, but he also avoided the actual victims. He avoided showing any compassion toward the people who have died, including the police officer. And that was not good for his image, but he was just delighted to revel in the crowd and talk about how, gee, what a great turnout here, as if everybody was there because of him.
Anita, what stood out to you in his visits to Corpus Christi and then to Austin?
Well, I mean, part of the problem is that he wanted to come really quickly. And so he wanted to come even before Tuesday. And so the problem then is you can't go to Houston. You can't go where the victims are and where there's flooding right now.
Can't get in the way of the
Can't get in the
recovery.
way. And so he is on the streets not seeing victims. Now, obviously, he could have still talked about them, could have talked about the people who died, the police officer, all the problems, the evacuees. So what stood out was he not only didn't see them, but he also didn't talk about them. And he did, in typical President Trump fashion, talk a lot about how grand and big and historic the storm is. And it's all of those things. It's just that after several days of that, it's sort of like you know, it's surprising that he didn't move on to talk about something else. Matt,
you wrote in an article last night, you quoted an expert saying the biggest risk that the president faced today was talking about himself. And he seemed to avoid that. He did wear a hat, which he's worn for 3 out of the 4 days, or some version of a hat that he's worn for the last 3 out of the 4 days, which is campaign merchandise, which sells for $40 on his website, and he's falling under some criticism for that.
Right. Well, I think it sort of speaks to the level of expectations people have for this president now, that the fact that he didn't talk about how much he beat Hillary Clinton by in Texas was seen as some sort of accomplishment. He did, of course, remark upon the crowd size, and as we've mentioned a few times here, he didn't really show a lot of compassion or empathy towards the victims down there or meet with any of them. Of course, he did work to get down there, did work to show that he's monitoring this storm closely. He's obviously put a lot of effort into that, tweeting about it constantly. His aides say he's very involved in monitoring all this. But I think anyone who was expecting to see a consoler-in-chief, someone down there demonstrating the kind of empathy we've seen from Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, just hasn't been paying attention since 2015. That's just not this president's style. You know, he might take some hits for the way he conducted himself down there today, some of those tone-deaf comments. But really, I think he's going to be judged by how FEMA does its job on the ground, and that remains to be seen.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.